Pearl Runyon's hired hand quit on the last day of August, and she felt the news in her spine before she felt it in her heart. She was standing at the kitchen window when she saw his bedroll tied to the saddle, and her whole back went rigid the way a fence post does the moment you realize the rot has claimed it clean through. She did not cry. Crying was something she had not had time for since her husband Clarence went into the ground 2 springs ago, and she did not intend to start now. She pressed her palm flat against the cool glass and watched Denny Soames ride south without once looking back, and she made a list in her head, the way she always did when disaster arrived. Fence on the north pasture, still down in 3 places. Hay yet to cut in the lower field. Winter stores not near enough. 24 head of cattle that needed moving before the first hard frost. She was one woman, 160 acres, and exactly $12 in the tin on the shelf. The wind off the Idaho high plain pressed against the house as if to remind her it had no sympathy whatsoever. She turned from the window and tied her apron tighter. The advertisement she placed in the Silver Creek Courier cost her 75 cents she could not spare. 6 words in the labor column. Ranch hand needed. Wages modest. Honest work. She wrote it out in her cleanest hand at the kitchen table that same evening. The lamp turned low to save oil, and she did not dress the offer up with promises she could not keep. She had learned early that a straight-told truth cost less in the long run than a flattering lie. The tin with $12 sat beside the inkwell while she wrote, and she looked at it once, and then she looked away. Morning came hard and bright, the way September mornings in Silver Creek always did, and Pearl Runyon hitched her mare to the wagon and drove to town. Gideon Hale read the advertisement on a Thursday. He was sitting on the steps of the Courier's print shop porch, because the print shop porch was free and a room at the Delaney Hotel was not. He had been in Silver Creek for 4 days. He had 60 cents, a bedroll, a decent pair of hands, and a reputation from a ranch outside Boise that he could document in writing if anyone cared to ask. He read the 6 words twice. Then he folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket and went to find the woman who had written it. Pearl was at the dry goods counter when the tall man came through the door. She knew him for an answer to her advertisement before he opened his mouth, because he was looking around the store with the steady, assessing gaze of a man who was already calculating the work, not the wages. That told her something. She turned to face him fully. He took off his hat. He said, "The ad said modest." "How modest?" She said, "Beans every day and beef once a week. A bunk in the barn until we see how things stand. $3 a month through November. $5 if you're still here come spring." He said, "What's the work?" She said, "Fence, hay, cattle, firewood, and whatever else breaks between now and the freeze." He said, "I'll do it." She put out her hand the way a man would. He shook it once, firm, and did not look surprised. She said, "My name is Pearl Runyon. I run the place alone." He said, "Gideon Hale. I'll need to know where the tools are kept." That was the whole of the negotiation. No flattery, no bargaining, no pauses full of second thoughts. The storekeeper, a wide man named Aldrich with ears that caught every whisper in Silver Creek, watched from behind his bolts of calico with undisguised interest. Pearl did not give him the satisfaction of a glance. She paid for her flour, tucked the sack under her arm, and walked out to the wagon. Gideon Hale followed at a respectful distance, and when she did not offer him a seat on the bench, he walked to the back and climbed in without being told, which she noted and filed away in the ledger she kept in her head, alongside every other fact that mattered. The ride to the ranch was 4 miles of flat road, with the mountains sitting blue and enormous to the north. Pearl drove and did not feel obligated to fill the silence. Gideon sat in the wagon bed with his bedroll across his knees and watched the land go past. Once she glanced back and found him studying the fence line along the east field with the same assessing quiet he'd had in the store. She faced front again. The wind was picking up from the northwest, carrying the first suggestion of something colder underneath. she said, without turning. "The fence on the north pasture is the worst of it. 3 posts gone, maybe 4. She said, "You'll look at it this afternoon. The cattle are in the south lot, but they won't stay there if the wind comes up." A pause. Then he said, "All right?" She drove. He did not argue, and she did not thank him for not arguing. When the wagon turned up the lane and the house came into view, a plain clapboard 2-story with a garden gone halfway to weeds on the east side, and a barn that needed paint badly but was structurally sound, she heard him shift in the wagon bed. She wondered what he was calculating. She did not ask. She pulled up at the barn and set the brake and climbed down before he could offer a hand. She was not unfriendly. She was efficient. There was a difference, and she had long since stopped worrying whether people understood it. She said, "The bunk is the second stall on the left. There's a blanket on it, but it's thin. If you need another, there's a cedar chest in the tack room." He said, "I'll manage." She said, "Supper is at 6. The child eats first." He looked at her then, the first time he'd held her gaze for more than a second. She held it back. She said, "I don't have a child, I just believe the most helpless thing at the table gets served first. Right now, that's the old dog." The corner of his mouth did something that was not quite a smile, but was something. He carried his bedroll into the barn. Pearl carried her flour into the house. The wind pushed hard at the back of her dress as she went, and she did not look back. He fixed the north fence that same afternoon, working with the focused economy of a man who did not need to be watched. Pearl could see him from the kitchen window if she stood at a certain angle, and she stood there once while she was peeling potatoes and watched him drive posts with a rhythm that was almost musical in its regularity. He found a 4th post that was gone entirely, and replaced it with lumber from the scrap pile without being asked. She saw him test each wire section with his hands before moving to the next, the way a man does when he's thinking ahead rather than just clearing the task in front of him. She went back to her potatoes. Supper that first evening was beans and cornbread and a pot of coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. Pearl set a place at the table, and Gideon came in from the barn with his hands washed and his hat left outside on the nail, which she had not told him to do, but which was the correct thing, and she appreciated it without saying so. They ate across from each other with the lamp between them. She kept the ledger in her head running. He ate without complaint and without flattery. He did not tell her the beans were good. He did not tell her they were poor. He ate them as a man eats when he has been hungry and has learned not to make a ceremony of it. When he finished, he carried his plate to the basin and rinsed it himself, set it on the shelf, and took his coffee to the door to drink standing and looking out at the yard. She said, "There's a list on the windowsill. Work for the week." He said, "I saw it." She said, "Any questions?" He said, "1. The lower field. How green is the hay?" She told him, and he nodded, and that was all. He drank off his coffee, set the cup on the step, and walked back to the barn. The old dog, a gray-muzzled hound named Biscuit, followed him halfway down the yard and then came back to the porch and lay down with a thump. Pearl watched from the doorway until she could no longer see Gideon in the dark, and then she went inside and blew out the lamp. The days found their shape the way water finds the low places. It was not immediate. The first week had the stiffness of 2 strangers learning each other's rhythms without wanting to admit that learning was happening. Pearl woke at 5 and had the stove going and coffee made before he came in from his morning rounds, which he had begun doing on the 3rd day without her asking, checking fence and stock before breakfast the way a man does when the land has gotten under his skin a little. She noticed. She did not remark on it. Gideon cut the lower field's hay on the 4th day, working from first light until the sun was straight above him, and then through the afternoon until the shadows were long and the air had gone gold and cold. Pearl brought water to the field at midday. Not lemonade, not a spread on a cloth, a clay jug of water and a piece of cornbread in a clean towel. set on the fence post at the field's edge without ceremony. When she walked back to the house, she heard him stop the scythe. She did not look back. When she found the jug and towel left clean on the porch step that evening, she set them inside without comment. But the small act of return, the towel folded, not just dropped, stayed with her the way small, precise things do. By the second week, the stiffness was easing, not because they spoke more, they did not speak more, but the silence between them had changed its quality, the way the same piece of ground changes between drought and a good soaking. It held more. Pearl caught herself, once, starting to tell him something about the cattle she'd been saving for a letter she'd never get around to writing, and she said it aloud instead to the room at large, and he answered from the barn doorway as if he'd been there the whole time, which he had. They both looked at the ground afterward, and then Pearl stirred the stew and Gideon went back to sharpening the mower blade. He built a second chair one evening in the third week. He did it while she was mending at the kitchen table, the first chair's twin, made from the same yellow pine as the one she sat in, with the same simple doweled back. He worked in the barn and she heard the rasp of the plane through the open door. When he brought it in and set it at the table without explanation, she looked at it for a long time. She said, "What's that for?" He said, "The one you have creaks on the left side. I noticed you shift your weight." She said, "You could have just fixed the one I have." He said, "Yes." She sat in the new chair, and it did not creak, and she folded her mending in her lap, and the lamp burned between them, and outside the first real autumn cold was settling down over the plain, like a hand pressing a quilt flat. It was a small moment. It was not a small moment. Pearl ran her thumb along the smooth arm of the chair and entered something in the ledger she kept in her head that had no column heading she knew the name of yet. Aldrich, the storekeeper's wife, had a tongue that could strip bark, and she used it freely on the subject of Pearl Runyon and her hired man. By early October, the gossip had made 2 full circuits of Silver Creek, that it was unseemly for a widow to take a strange man onto her place and let him sleep in the barn, that the arrangement could only mean one thing, and that one thing was not respectable. Pearl heard it from the blacksmith's wife, who told her in the kindest possible way, which was still not very kind. Pearl thanked her and drove home and said nothing about it at supper. What broke her silence was not the gossip but what rode behind it. On a Tuesday morning in the second week of October, a man named Vestal Kroom rode up the lane with a younger man beside him, and a piece of paper folded in his coat. Vestal Kroom was the agent for the Northern Valley Land Consolidation, which was a company based in Portland that had been buying up small claims throughout the county, by whatever method was quickest. He wore a very clean coat for a man riding a dusty road. Pearl met him on the porch. He said her name was on a promissory note that had been held by the Silver Creek Savings, and that the savings had sold that note to the consolidation, and that under the terms of the note she had until November 1st to pay the balance in full or cede the land. He said this pleasantly. He had a pleasant face that Pearl did not trust at all. She said, "I have never signed a note with the Silver Creek Savings." He said, "The note was signed by a Clarence Runyon." He produced the paper. She looked at the paper. Clarence had signed it, that was true. In 1889, 3 years before he died. Pearl had not known. Her jaw tightened. She kept her face still. She said, "What is the balance?" He said, $84. She said, "I will need to see the original terms." He said he would bring them on his next visit, which would be the 30th, one day before November 1st. He folded the paper back into his coat with the care of a man replacing a weapon. He said he was sorry about her husband. He said it without sorrow. He and the younger man rode back down the lane. Pearl stood on the porch until they were gone, and then she sat down on the step. The old dog pressed his gray head into her knee. She sat with her hand on his ears and thought. $84. She had 14. The cattle could bring 40 at market if she got them there before the prices dropped, which meant the first week of October, which was now. The hay was in. The fence was sound. She needed the cattle moved to Silver Creek inside of 3 days, and she needed a fair price from a buyer who would not know she was selling under pressure. She heard the barn door and looked up. Gideon had seen the riders. He was standing at the corner of the barn with his thumbs in his belt, watching the road. She said, "I have a problem." He said, "I know, I heard." She said, "Can we move the herd to Silver Creek by Thursday?" He said, "I'll have them ready by Wednesday night." She said, "Kroom will have talked to the buyers before we get there." He said, "I know a man named Pruitt who buys independent of the consolidation. He runs cattle north to the railhead. If you want, I'll ride to him tonight." She looked at him. She said, "You know Pruitt?" He said, "I worked for him 2 seasons ago. He's fair." She said, "All right." He said, "Pearl." It was the first time he had used her name without the Runyon after it. She registered it the way you register a change in the wind. He said, "We'll make the balance." She held his look for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "Go find Pruitt." He rode out within the hour. She went inside and counted the $14 in the tin and put the tin back on the shelf and cooked the beans and put them on the back of the stove to stay warm. And it was possible, she allowed, that she was not entirely alone in this. The thought was not frightening. It was only unfamiliar, the way a room looks when you move the furniture after years of the same arrangement. You have to learn it all over again. But the room is no smaller. Gideon came back before midnight with Pruitt's word in writing on a folded note. Pearl was still at the kitchen table. The lamp was burning. She had not gone to bed. She did not explain why she had not gone to bed, and he did not ask. He laid the note on the table and she read it, and then she looked up at him. He was tired and dusty from the night ride, and he had done it without being asked to do more than she had asked, which was only to find Pruitt, not to negotiate terms, and he had negotiated terms. She said, "You told him our situation." He said, "I told him you had cattle worth buying and a deadline worth moving fast for. That's all he needed." She said, "The price he's offered. It's more than I hoped for." He said, "He respects a clean herd. Yours is clean." She said, "It's your work that made it clean." He said, "It's your land they grazed on." They sat with that for a moment. The lamp threw warm light across the table, and outside the night had gone very still, the way October nights do when the cold is gathering itself before a push. Pearl folded the note and put it with the tin. Then she did something that surprised her. She got up and poured 2 cups of coffee and put one in front of the empty chair without asking whether he wanted it, because she already knew. He sat. They drank their coffee at the table and the lamp burned and neither of them said anything, and it was the most comfortable Pearl had felt in a house in 2 years. The cattle drive to Silver Creek took a day and a half, and Pruitt's men met them at the county road. Gideon managed the herd with a horse and a patience that Pearl watched with appreciation she had stopped trying to suppress. When a buyer tries to shortchange a seller in front of hired hands, it is usually because the buyer thinks the seller is frightened. Pearl was not frightened. She stood beside Pruitt's foreman at the counting, and she knew her numbers and she said them clearly, and the foreman did not argue, and when the final count was settled and the draft written, she had $49 in hand, and the consolidation's 84 was within reach. She sold 2 pieces of jewelry that had been her mother's. She sold them to a jeweler in Silver Creek who gave her a fair price because she did not seem desperate, which she was, but which she had learned never to show. The 2 pieces brought $18. With the 14 already in the tin, she had 81. 3 short. Gideon set his October wages on the kitchen table that evening without ceremony. She said, "I can't take your pay." He said, "It's $3. Take it." She said, "This wasn't in the agreement." He said, "Neither was the fence post I replaced out of my own pocket, and neither was the chair. Some things you do because they need doing. She looked at the $3 on the table. She looked at him. She said, I will pay you back. He said, I know you will. She took the $3. She had 84. On the 30th, when Vestal Kroom rode up the lane with his pleasant face and his paper, Pearl Runyon met him on the porch with the payment in full in an envelope addressed in her clearest hand. Gideon stood at the barn door. He did not come forward. He did not need to, but he was there, and Kroom saw him, and some of the pleasantness went out of Kroom's face when he saw him. Kroom took the envelope and opened it and counted. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said he supposed she was entitled to keep the property. Pearl said, Yes, she is. Kroom rode away. The younger man followed. The dust settled on the lane and the wind came off the plain, and Pearl let out a breath she had been holding, it seemed to her, since August. She turned and walked back to the house, and as she passed the barn she said, without stopping, Thank you. Gideon said, from the doorway, You did it yourself. She said, No, I didn't. She went inside. He stayed at the barn door a moment longer, watching the empty lane, and then he turned back to his work. November arrived, and with it the question neither of them had spoken. His contract ran through November. After November there was no arrangement. Pearl had known this was coming the way you know a winter is coming. You can feel it in the ground before you see it in the sky. She had not addressed it because addressing it required her to know what she wanted, and knowing what she wanted required her to admit something she had been moving slowly toward since the evening of the new chair. She addressed it on a Thursday evening. She had made a proper supper, beef and roasted potatoes and fresh bread because she had been working up to this all week, and they ate it and cleared the plates and she poured the coffee and she sat down in her chair that did not creak, and she said his name. She said, Gideon. He looked up. She said, Your contract ends November 30th. He said, It does. She said, I'd like to offer you a new arrangement. He waited. He had that quality. She had come to rely on it. He waited without filling the space with noise. She said, Winter here is not modest. I need someone who knows this land now. You know it, and I think you are not in a hurry to be anywhere else, though you are free to say if I'm wrong. He said, You're not wrong. She said, I am not asking for more than what we have. I am asking if what we have is something you'd choose to continue. He looked at his coffee cup. He looked at her. He said, Pearl, what we have is more than a contract and you know it. The lamp burned. Outside the first snow of the season was coming down soft and straight. No wind yet, the way it does on its polite evenings before it remembers what it is. She said, I know it. He said, Then I'd like to continue it, under whatever terms feel right to you. She said, The terms I have in mind are less like an agreement and more like a life, if that sounds reasonable to you. He said, It sounds like the most reasonable thing anyone has said to me in a long time. She put her hand on the table. He put his hand over hers. The snow came down. The stove ticked. The old dog sighed from his place by the door. Pearl Runyon looked at the lamp and felt something that had been clenched in her chest since 2 springs ago begin, very slowly, to release. It did not release all at once. That is not how it works. But it began, and beginning was everything. In the spring they went to the preacher, a lean and serious man named Reverend Cord, who performed 3 weddings a year in Silver Creek, and was not given to sentiment, but who nevertheless shook Gideon's hand with what Pearl recognized as real approval. She wore a dress that had been her mother's and had let out 2 inches at the hem by lantern light the night before. Gideon wore his second shirt, the clean one, and had borrowed a proper collar from the deacon, who was a generous man. It was a short ceremony. Plain words, true ones. Aldrich's wife was there and had the grace to seem pleased, or at least to keep whatever she felt where no one could see it. The blacksmith's wife cried, which Pearl found both unexpected and touching. After, there was coffee at the church hall, and someone had brought a layer cake, which Biscuit the old dog attempted to reach from outside the window until Gideon moved him gently aside and gave him a biscuit instead, which was appropriate, Pearl noted. They drove home in the wagon in the last of the April light, the mountains enormous and green-shouldered to the north, the lower fields already showing the first growth of the season. Pearl drove. Gideon sat beside her on the bench, which was new. The road was the same 4 miles it had always been. It was entirely different. He said, "The south fence needs attention before we turn the cattle out." She said, "I know. I put it on the list." He said, "I saw the list. You also put re-shingle the barn roof." She said, "It's been leaking over the south corner since March." He said, "I'll get to it this week." She said, "We'll get to it." He looked at her. That almost smile again, the one she had catalogued since the first day in the store. Only this time it finished itself. It became an actual smile, unhurried and unguarded, and it changed his face entirely. Pearl faced front and drove and did not try to keep the warmth from her own face because there was no reason to anymore. The wagon rolled on. The fields spread out on either side, and every inch of them was hers and his and the work of every day they had built together from the ground up. There is a kind of love that does not arrive the way the songs say it does. It does not knock loudly at the door on a single bright morning. It comes the way spring comes to the Idaho high plain, slowly by degrees, through the small, persistent warmth of 10,000 ordinary moments. A jug of water on a fence post, a chair that does not creak, a man who rides through the night for a woman he barely knows yet, because it is the right thing, and he knows it without being told. You cannot rush it, and you cannot force it, and the wisest thing you can do when it comes is simply to be steady enough that it finds a place to settle. Pearl was steady. Gideon was steady. And the ledger that Pearl had kept in her head all that year, the one with no column heading she'd known the name of, well, by the time the snow came down that November evening and he put his hand over hers, she had found the name for it. She had written it at the top, in her clearest hand. Home. If this story found something true in your heart tonight, leave a word in the comments. Tell us what moment turned the tide for you, the fence post or the chair, or that ride through the dark. We love hearing from you. Subscribe if you'd like more journeys out of the Old West, more lives built from plain courage and honest work, more love that earns its name one quiet day at a time. Good night. God bless you, and safe travels wherever the road takes you next.